Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's event on this rather miserable afternoon in Kirkwall. We're here this afternoon for an update on the Cairns excavations down in South Ronaldsay by the site director, Martin Carruthers, who's standing beside me. Work began on the Cairns in 2006 and it revealed a large broch and associated structures dating from the Iron Age through to the Norse period. Over the years, the digs uncovered some incredible artefacts, including in 2016 an incredibly well-preserved closing deposit, which, when excavated, was found to include a whalebone vessel which contained the mandible of an elderly female who became known as the Elder. And in 2018, a wooden bowl that was found in what was the so-called well at the broch, and it gave us some unexpected insights into the reuse of artefacts in prehistory, and also provided samples of a 2,000-year-old human hair. So while these finds are really headline grabbing and exciting, some of the smaller finds are more invaluable in telling us and providing insights into the everyday life of the people that were inhabiting the broch. So with that short background, I'll pass over to Martin to give us an update on what the latest news on the Cairns is. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you very much, Moira. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah? Moira's just done my job, so I can go home now. Bye. See you later on. That was very good. Thank you very much for that. I now can just ride roughshod over huge swathes of information about the site based on that update from Moira, so thanks very much. And again, I'd echo Moira's sentiments. Thanks very much for coming out on an early autumnal day and showing your enthusiasm for Orcadian archaeology consequently. So thank you, well done. And thanks very much to the organisers for inviting me to come along and talk about the excavations. Very close to my heart and very obsessively present in my head, as you can probably imagine. I just went with the title that was suggested to me to give a bald account of an update, I suppose based on our most recent season of excavations in 2025 at the site, but I couldn't resist doing the pretentious academic thing of actually adding in something of a subtitle. And in this case, I've gone a bit over the top because I've made it way too long and way too wordy than it really should be. But for those of you that can't make it out against that lovely South Ronaldsay sea spray there, it says, assembling ancestry and crafting kin at the Cairns Iron Age settlement, Orkney. So hopefully it will emerge exactly what I mean by some of those terms. I probably don't really need to state too much in terms of the geographical background to the site along these lines of showing a map with South Ronaldsay earmarked in it. However, what I would draw your attention to, I guess, is the date brackets there, 2006 to 2026. Next year will be the final season of excavations at the Cairns altogether, and at that point it'll be 20 years since we've begun the excavations at the Cairns, and it's even longer ago that we actually began to do field work in that landscape, because believe it or not, we've actually excavated another, albeit slightly smaller and earlier Iron Age site in that landscape. And I'm not going to say very much at all about that today, but be aware this is a much more than a single site project. It involves the landscape through a variety of different archaeological techniques, which includes geophysical survey, test pitting, paleo-environmental sampling and coring, as well as selective excavation in the wider environs beyond the Cairns. So we're trying to really contextualise the site, and we're trying to resist the urge that Orcadian archaeologists, or rather excavators in Orkney, have largely been unable to resist until the last few decades, of just focusing in on a trench, a nodal point in the landscape, and going route one for those amazing monumental structures that Orkney and the north of Scotland are rightly famous for. Now, mea culpa, I put my hand up here, I'm as guilty as anyone of doing that, but we do at least hope and seek to broaden out our study, and one of our key research aims is to understand the chronological, the cultural, the ecological, and the social and political context of the site within its landscape setting and beyond. And hopefully some of the things I'm going to talk about this afternoon will elucidate that to some extent. The other thing about the excavations is that over those 20 years that we've been active on site, it's been a very strong training location, not only for our own UHI students, but for students from beyond our institution as well. And hopefully, if it wasn't too posed, the smiley faces in the various pictures there give an example of the kind of satisfaction and enjoyment and the busyness and industriousness that people get out of the excavations, I would like to think. And some of them have gone on to have good careers, despite the fact of being momentarily trapped on site by me. Well, I did say you probably didn't need much of a geographical insight into where we're talking about, but I would be remiss of me not to draw your attention to our little corner of southeast South Ronaldsay, above Winnock Bay, inland for our site with that beautiful prospect. Some of these pictures here are quite a few years old now, but they do illustrate something of the beautiful landscape and, as important as that, the wonderful prospect that you acquire from the site on a good day, which of course South Ronaldsay in the summer is, unremitting sunshine each and every day of the excavation work. The site's quite complex, multi-period, multi-phase, deeply stratified, very well preserved, structures above my head, principally the broch, but also structures below my feet in the sense of subterranean buildings like our souterrain or structure F. This is just a smorgasbord of some of the principal structures that exist across the site, and of a variety of different eras, broch period and post-broch period there, mostly contained within the Iron Age, but also with an ephemeral signature of the Viking Norse period as well, particularly over in the northern corner of the site, or the north central corner of the site. And the site runs from about the latter 1st century BC all the way through the successive centuries of the middle and later Iron Age periods as conventionally carved up by archaeological chronologies, and then, as I say, into the Viking Norse, and really even into the later medieval and post-medieval periods thereafter. This gives a bit of an indication of the site. It's not a very, not sure the video will work. Yeah, because of the laser pointers on. I know that might do it. Not to worry. It wasn't a very dynamic video in any case. In fact, it moved not a jot. The only thing that moved in this video, if you can imagine it, are some of the tiny little figures of humanity. And all it really does is illustrate just what a monumental structure our principal broch building actually is. Here's another view of it, or rather a view of taken from a still from a three-dimensional sketchfab model produced by erstwhile colleague Dr. Hugo Anderson Weinmartin out at the National Museum of Scotland. But it does illustrate something of that, the substance and the surviving remains. And here, zoomed out slightly into the landscape, is a rendition of our site sat within the complex ditched enclosure system that surrounds it, which we know of through remote sensing, through a geophysical survey, and also through test pitting. So these earthworks encircle the site. Here's the broch in the centre, and this is showing what we call phase 3 early, which is the initial phase of settlement that surrounds the broch, a variety of buildings I'll talk you through a tiny little bit shortly. And the light green illustrates what we call multi-valley ditched enclosure around the front of the broch, of the site, as we define it in reference to the main entrance of the broch itself. And this long linear earthwork, which is also visible in aerial photographs as well as the geophysics, represents a hollow way, a pathway, a routeway that we've test pitted that runs up the hill from the bay, or from the direction of the bay, and up through the twin entrance thresholds of the enclosure system and up into the village settlement that surrounded the site. And if you want to see that without the modern field boundaries, there's just another little version of it. And one of the things that brings home is that as substantial as the trench actually is at the site, and if you've ever visited the site, you'll know full well that it's a big old trench with a large open area. As substantial as that is, this sort of brings home how much space there is within the enclosure system, but outside of our main trench. And that really shows us what a smallish percentage of the overall settlement area that we're dealing with. Albeit we are bang centre right over the middle of the principal structure in terms of our research questions, at least that massive monumental Broch building at the heart of it. And what you can also see here is portions of the ditched enclosure as they appear within the excavation trench, and also the excavated portions of the ditch that are within the main trench, and how they align or in some cases perhaps don't quite align with the geophysical signature of those enclosing earthworks. And altogether, the maximum diameter of that enclosure space is about 80 metres from external outer ditch lip to the opposite external outer ditch lip. So quite substantial, to say the least. Okay, a few very quick facts. Get going. So 17 seasons of excavation. We've not been active throughout all those 20 years, COVID and all of that. 24 Iron Age buildings that we've partially or wholly excavated, thousands of artefacts in that time, tens of thousands of animal bones, faunal remains, which are an incredibly important part of the picture that we hope to present of the Iron Age, and an incredibly important part of the post-excavation work that's already begun and which will conclude when we've finished the excavations in a few years' time. And then thousands of soil samples, environmental samples of a variety of different types and characters to answer different sorts of questions at different levels of granularity, but telling us all the time about people's social practices, about ritual practices, believe it or not, from environmental samples, about the ecology, the environment, and the activities underway on the site, the subsistence patterns, crop husbandry regimes, all sorts of interesting information. And just a few, the artefacts, typical artefacts on the site, lots of pottery, lots of stone tools, everything from loom weights to spindle whorls to slightly rarer, lovely fired clay moulds for casting bronze jewellery, personal adornment. More on these in brief shortly. And long-handled comb in this case, and copper alloy artefacts like this tiny chain link or the head of this spiral pin. And then lovely objects like these, a moment of colour, a flash of colour, glass beads. That's the majority, but not all, of the 14 or 15 or so glass beads. And it's that sustained environmental sampling, 100% recovery of all the occupation deposits and floor deposits from the insides of the floors of buildings, especially the Broch, that also has the peripheral benefit as well as the environmental evidence and information of yielding these micro artifacts, tiny things which previous generations of excavators perhaps might well have missed because they wouldn't have been recovering 100% of occupation deposits from buildings like these. And then more unusual items from the site, items that we've every right to imagine were unusual even in the Iron Age. We very rarely have figurative art, for example. So this picture on the left, Winnick Willie, or the Cairns character, as he's sometimes known, or she is known, an anthropomorphic, three-dimensional anthropomorphic representation, which for the middle and first part of the late Iron Age are incredibly rare to encounter something like that out with the high relief, slightly later Pictish symbol stones, of course. So that's unusual and probably always was an unusual sort of thing. For some reason in the Iron Age, they don't necessarily go in for a lot of anthropomorphic representation in the north of Scotland at any rate. And then objects which may or may not have been particularly rare, and I couldn't resist the temptation of 3 pictures for the price of 1 of our wooden bowl that Moira mentioned at the beginning there. So a nice line drawing of it, and then an image of it during conservation and an image of it post-conservation. And an object like that may not have been that rare in the Iron Age, but what is exceedingly rare are the preservation conditions to render it complete to us some 2,000 years hence. So it's the preservation circumstances, the anaerobic waterlogged conditions that preserve it, as they did something as delicate as that thing there on the lower right-hand side, a little knotted human hair recovered from the well structure at the site. I mentioned the importance of animal bone and how much of it, what quantity we have of it, and it's our way in, one of our major ways of understanding issues like identity, social identity, and distinction and difference. We want to try and question what brochs are, what the village settlements are that surround them, which we find so frequently in Orkney, but also in Cairns and to some extent in southern Shetland. And we want to be able to do that beyond what has been practiced in previous years or generations of archaeologists, where the simple index of artefacts found within a broch versus outside the broch was kind of quite simplistically read off as an index of social status, so the finery is inside the broch, therefore the broch is a high status settlement, based on tiny numbers of objects in reality, and not very statistically viable in my opinion, and a much more accurate, much more precise, much more solid and substantial way into thinking about the relationship between broch inhabitants and the villagers surrounding it is to look at the different access to food that they had, the different food types, the different quantities of food, the different species of animals, the different joints of meat and cuts of meat that were available or were being processed and consumed. And that for me is perhaps a much more substantial index, much more reliable index of the relative status of these different elements of the community, and perhaps between this community and other contemporary communities beyond as well. And as well as the sheer volume of animal bone and midden material, we also get, this is from this season's excavation 2025, what we call associated bone groups, or what sometimes some people call articulated bone groups, ABGs of one kind or another, articulated animal bone groups present in circumstances that lead us to believe that these are intentionally or deliberately deposited portions of animals. And the Iron Age is replete with these across the whole of the British Isles in actual fact, but certainly in Atlantic Scotland we have our fair share of them. They're better understood and more and have been recognised for longer in the Western Isles, where often they are placed into pits under the floors of houses. And then field archaeologists have been very clear that those are intentional deposits placed into pits beneath the floors of those buildings. And in Orkney, what we've been finding is we've been missing these ABGs. They're present in large numbers also in Orkney and in Shetland, but rather than placed into pits, they seem to be placed immediately underneath the renewal episodes of new floors in buildings, and particularly underneath slabs. So when you lift slabs up episodically in the course of excavation, you'll find animal bone groups immediately underneath them, to some extent a little bit squished, which I fear also has led field archaeologists to kind of relegate them to a not as formally deposited category as the Western Isles variants. There's a difference in practice here in the Northern Isles from the Western Isles in this regard, but assuredly they are placing animals into the ground in particular ways, and it seems to mark episodes of renewal. It's foundations of buildings, it's the renewal of new floors, refurbishment, and then it's the closure of buildings, it's the decommissioning. So these animal bone remains are really important. The main picture there shows a antler still attached to a portion of the skull with neck bones in place and vertebrae, and then on the right hand side here, one of a red deer foot bone. And here one just outside the broch wall, again from 2025, an articulated spinal column from juvenile cattle. So lots of these, and they may well be joints of meat, they may well be spent food items in a sense, but immediately upon consumption, or at least consumption of part of the meat that was formerly wrapped around these bone items, they're placed in circumstances that suggest that they are some form of votive perhaps, or some sort of intentional marking of the passage of time and seminal events within the community's life. Okay, for a moment, life outside the broch, because in 2025 we had a good old go at the front exterior of the broch, and we were able to make great strides and able to see an awful lot that was previously concealed by phase upon phase of later buildings and structures, and we were able to make our way through those and able to see some of the earlier broch period, the contemporary village buildings. But before we do that, just to recognise that in doing that, we were able to see this beautiful profile, that lovely sloping wall batter that goes with the broch itself. Oops. And there's a picture of that broch. And the village, some of the external or extramural buildings that surrounded it. And we got a bit of a nice surprise actually, because one of our buildings that we had kind of thought of as post-broch in date actually turned out to be very much Middle Iron Age and contemporary with the broch, and very carefully and elaborately constructed with some really nice features in it. And that structure U over there, just to the south of the exterior wall face of the broch itself. And that included recovering this lovely kind of triple shelved, what we call the cocktail cabinet from the outside of the broch, which you can see on the right hand side there with its lovely superimposed niches. And immediately to the left of that, an intact and still roofed chamber, partially corbelled chamber set in the wall of that building. So nice complex architecture, very much the kind of thing we expect to see in the Middle Iron Age period, contemporary with the broch. And even the last contents or the last things stored in that little niche cupboard, beautifully constructed, this little cobblestone tool placed on the ledge of that cupboard. So lovely to see that kind of thing present and important, because, as I say, one of our principal aims, one of our main research aims, is to be able to compare suites of material and evidence, including animal bone and residues of people's activities on site, from the village buildings to the contemporary broch, and be able to compare one against the other. A feat that has so often eluded archaeologists. And I should have said from the outset, that the number of brochs that have been fully excavated in terms of the floor deposits are vanishingly rare. Half a dozen brochs have been excavated in the modern era, and of those, one other, apart from the Cairns, has had all of the floor and occupation deposits excavated in the same modern, scientific, thorough standards that we're seeking to apply at the Cairns. So, whenever anybody says, why bother digging another broch? Well, because actually vanishingly few of them have been excavated to anything like the standard that would allow us to apply modern questions and retrieve modern answers to the kinds of research interests that we have these days. And then, as well as that structure U there on the south side, details were resolving themselves on the main eastern exterior of the broch itself, and particularly structure T and structure O. And these buildings, very like the buildings at Howe, excavated in the late 1970s, early 1980s, just outside Stromness, where you have buildings that actually literally use the exterior wall of the broch as one of their walls. So the building is complete by virtue of the fact that it's almost semi-detached and bound into the exterior wall of the broch. And that's quite interesting. In architectural terms, it's interesting in terms of what we can therefore work out in terms of the sequence of construction. But I also think it's quite significant in terms of the symbolic expression of the relationship of these village buildings to the broch. They're utterly threaded in, they're dependent, and they're integrated with the broch. And they very much are making a statement of belonging with and to that broch. And what goes for the architecture, I suspect, very strongly also goes for generations of inhabitants of these buildings as well, and how they saw themselves and how they expressed their identities. So for example, much of the larger contemporary village buildings associated with brochs, including at Gurness and at Howe and at the Cairns also, those larger ones are often closer set to the broch itself. It is as if the statement has been made that the closer you are to the broch, the more wherewithal, the more status, the more initiative you're able to take within this community, and it's represented by the resplendent fixtures and furniture of the buildings, like the structure U that we saw a moment ago. And then, as well as being able to recover quite a large suite of animal bone and environmental remains from those buildings, as we were excavating them this year, we were able to reach nice features at the foot around the broch wall. So drains, which may seem a bit mundane and prosaic, but any archaeologist will tell you drains are manna from heaven because of the likely or potential environmental conditions that pertain within them, and also really for working out the way in which a settlement like this is planned and how they're taken on board, their understanding of the local hydrology and what they want to do and how they want to keep areas dry and where those drains are moving from. And in the Neolithic period of Orkney, where drains are also very common in the architecture of settlement structures, including the Ness of Brodgar and Scatterbrae famously, those drains often also evoke particular relationships between buildings. You know, some drain systems connect areas of sites and disconnect from other areas of sites, and it's almost as if purity and hygiene in literal terms is also connected to moral purity, the social order and its view of things as well. And so drains, I think, are even more interesting than we might imagine in that regard. And as well as drains, we also had covered culverts that are running through the walls of some of the village buildings, this one going through Structure O. So that's built into the construction of that building from the outset, and it shows that various effluents and materials and substances are being drawn out from particular areas and drained off, and on their passage they're going through the footings of buildings, and that's really informative for us, I guess. We've got just another view of some of the village buildings, Structure O, just outside the broch, so good neighbours of excavators either side of the wall there. And a nice suite of artefacts as well. Our earliest rotary quern, I'll return to querns shortly, but our earliest rotary quern from the site is this one, splendidly modelled by our fine supervisor Kevin Kerr there, just from Structure O, one of our village buildings. And I mentioned already as well as that in 2025 we were able to get to grips with and finish the excavation, the last vestiges of excavation and survey and recording that we needed to undertake on the subterranean complex immediately outside the front door of the broch. So that's to say the souterrain, in this case a complex souterrain structure which we've been kind of working on and off over a number of seasons, and the time was right and ripe this year to complete that excavation, and that threw up some really nice opportunities to do some more sampling, more recording, and secure a really nice narrative of what this subterranean structure was all about, from its construction, its use to its end point. So that's all very nice and useful for us. Okay. Back to the broch then. It is a lovely thing, and I'm not going to pretend that I don't love brochs, much as I might have an ambiguous relationship with the concept of the broch itself. You know, it's the idea of a broch and the archaeological category and classification sometimes arguably gets in the way and takes up too much of our time and effort as we endlessly pore over classifications and detailed architectural typologies. And what we want to do at the Cairns, what we've always wanted, well, I've always wanted to do at the Cairns, is get to the nub of the issue. What were people actually doing when they constructed this thing? What were they actually doing when they lived in it? What were they actually doing when they ended the thing? How was it used? And how did people undertake lives in and around it, rather than what we call it as such? And there's a lovely view of it taken by colleague Bobby Threel at Take the High View, just a low-level aerial UAV or drone shot of it. this year in 2025, just to give you a lovely view of the substance and the bulk of that building. What a lovely thing to be able to excavate. Little view of the interior of it, and the interior of it's always been one of our principal focuses. And we've thrown a succession of radiocarbon dates at the Broch and the Broch interior as well. And we're closing in on it. We've reached the earliest occupation deposits and some of the construction deposits related to the Broch. And we think it's quite a late one. And that's quite important in a number of ways that hopefully I'll remember to be more explicit about in just a moment or two. And it probably really kicks off in the later 1st century BC or the earlier 1st century AD. So in Orcadian terms, that makes it relatively late in terms of Broch building. And then it's ended, and we've got really quite reliable dating evidence for its conclusion around about AD 200. So it's up and running for about a couple of hundred years. So several generations for sure, but not as long as some of the Brochs that are occupied in the north of Scotland, like, Scalloway Broch, excavated by Neil Sharples in the late 1990s, where it was found to have been up and running for about 500 years, half a millennium of occupation, quite astonishing. And a lovely sign of progress, but not a particularly lovely looking slide, but nevertheless, heartening for us on site in terms of looking forward to our final season next year was the fact that everywhere we excavated this year, inside the Broch, we were encountering the natural, we were encountering the base of deposits, we were seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, we were reassuring ourselves that yes, indeed, we might finish properly on time next year as forecast and as hoped. So that was very heartening. And it also means we can start to be more conclusive and more fulsome in our recognition of the suite of deposits and activities that have been undertaken inside the Broch. We're not about to be surprised massively now, we hope, by unexpected turnings up on site in the next season. So that's hopefully the case. But there were a few surprises nevertheless. So we've got very used to there being very substantial complexes of hearths, one built on top of the other in particular areas of the Broch interior. I'll point them out to you in a minute. So we started excavating a bit more in the North Room this year, which isn't one of those areas that has previously had much in the way of hearth settings in it, and lo and behold we encounter another hearth. So this Broch is heavily in-hearthed, if that could be used as a term. And that's just one of the things that immediately makes you think this is a bit of an odd structure, a bit of an odd thing going on here on this site and in this particular Broch. And this is just a nice overview of it. So let's have a wee think about those internal arrangements for a second. Let's look at it. So most Brochs don't really look like this one. But we're really lucky, we're really blessed with the fact that we've got fantastic, coherent internal architecture inside our structure. So as well as all those amazing superimposed floor deposits and occupation deposits that I've mentioned a few times now, importantly, we also have the three-dimensional upstanding architecture, the orthostatic partitions, the divisions, the panels that separate one area from another area internally within that Broch. And it's quite surprising actually, because what we have found is that it's very, very complexly subdivided internally. They've really gone to town on it. And at first sight it's quite confusing as to what's going on, but actually it's so coherent that you can very easily, after concentrating on it for a short time, you can work out movement around the interior of this structure, and you can really see how that movement was regulated and governed and guided and controlled, arguably, in the sense of where you could walk and access and where you couldn't access from different regions within the interior of the structure. And I'm not going to go on about this ad nauseum in huge amounts of detail, but if you add that to that nice, neat internal subdivision to our burgeoning sense of what was going on inside those rooms time after time, or generation after generation, we could build a really nice complex picture of what's been going on. So in the southeast room, we go through a sequence of hearth and floors and little corridor spaces, and we have slab floors up here and a little annex or aisle up in this area, a central hearth in that southeast room, and another little paved area over on the southeast side of that room, built against the interior wall of the Broch, of course, and very heavily subdivided out away from the rest of the interior. Lots of hearth rake out, and indeed in its first evolution, that hearth looks a bit more like that, with slab surface, or at least we thought it was the first iteration of it, but it isn't actually, as we shall see. And what we found this year was actually a little tiny feature, this stone slab with stone setting around it that we thought was a sort of secondary hearth base, turned out actually to be an ash box that had been capped by a little slab, so they'd closed it off very deliberately. And that the earliest iteration of that hearth, in fact, was a sort of bowl or cut-shaped thing cut down into the clay floor of this room. Just one of lots of things that make this southeast room different from the rest of the Broch interior, in terms of the way the walls were constructed, in terms of the fact that some of the walls were rendered in clay, and in terms of the fact that there was a multicoloured clay floor laid very deliberately as a beaten earth clay floor on the surface. And just one of the other oddities is the bowl hearth that they initially utilised inside the interior. And after a while, deposits build up, and the plan's a bit boring on the left hand side there, because there aren't many features, because it's just the hearth mound surrounded by the waste material from that hearth building up over time and smothering the floors. All the slabs get smothered and covered in detritus from the hearth. And next up, a new hearth, the orangey slabs there, and some new slabs. And then next up, smothered in deposits again, so it looks bland like that again. And then next up, another flag floor, and the hearth disappears at this stage. And then next up in time, another hearth, the orangey, slightly amorphous shape there, with a few more slabs. And then finally, the sort of termination sequence of things they're doing at the very end of it, where the building seems to be degrading at this point, and rubble infill finally. So that's the southeast room. And then similarly, in the west room, and beautifully evidenced this year through brand new slab floor, slab hearth, I should say, that we encountered in the centre of it. In the west room, again, in its initial iteration, flag floor in this area here, the sort of northwest bay, beautiful big flag floor, central hearth, and smaller flagstones around it, and ashy material building up beyond, and another ash box, actually interesting analogy or parallel with the southeast room, and it's that northern part of the west room that I'm talking about now. And then again, hearth loses its identity in terms of a slab, starts to burst out beyond its former area. Occupation material covers all the slabbed areas. That chokes up the room, and then they replace it with a new slab floor, quite a frenetically busy one by the looks of that. A new central hearth, trapezoidally shaped hearth at the centre of that, which itself breaks up through the incessant heat of the fire. And then that is smothered, the detritus from that hearth and the rake out from it is smothering the floors and building up more floor or occupation deposits internally. They put a new hearth in, and then yet again that's bursting out and smothering and losing its identity, and so on and so forth to the end. So what we're actually seeing in the lifespan of the Broch is something that actually I think is probably evident in the excavations of other Brochs, but it's not often pulled out and picked out as much as I think it ought to be, is that basically life in this Broch over a number of generations is recursive. And what they're doing is that they're repeating the circumstances of day-to-day life and renewing it every so often, episodically. they're renewing it and refurbishing the circumstances of it, and blithely sticking with it over lots and lots of generations, over the long term, over the long durée of the inhabitation of this broch. So they're at pains to repeat, rinse and repeat, as it were. And that's really interesting from the point of view of the sort of the maintenance of that broch lifestyle and the maintenance of the household and lifestyle. Now in that west room, it's full of lovely artefacts. So that west room is really, really crammed with occupation deposits. It's a lovely thing to behold as a field archaeologist because it's full of detritus, including lots of decorated pottery. Much of it really quite tiny and dinky and fine. And it's these fine pots that seem to be particularly favoured for decorative elaboration, and hence they break up quite easily, I think, because they're so small and fine and delicate. But they're assuredly there. And at least one archaeologist, again Neil Sharples, has suggested that all this decorated pottery, one of the few categories of object that's relatively commonly decorated in the Iron Age, is intended to be used in the sharing of food in communal meals and in important feasting times, so that people recognise the occasion and the social importance of it through these decorative vessels that are passing from hand to hand around the central hearts of buildings. And the other thing that we've had profusely out the building, and there's a bit of a mystery over these so-called bone mounts or plaques, these perforated objects, often of antler or whalebone or sometimes cattle bone. And this year we were getting them with their little pegs still in situ, like this one. So they're clearly intended to be hammered into a slightly larger object. And one of the leading interpretations of them, or suggestions at least of them, is that they're binding for boxes or frames. So vessels or containers perhaps of wood which haven't survived, or maybe frames that would be used for any number of different things, but including perhaps looms and other textile and weaving setups. So it's all good stuff, and as well as, I mentioned this already, but just to illustrate an example of it, as well as the objects that are just trapped in deposits that are maybe on a day-to-day basis just raked out from the heart of these rooms, we've also got objects that seem to be a little bit more considered, a little bit more conscious intention behind them. So definable through the fact that they're occurring just as we've got the cleavage between one of the occupation deposits and the next one. It's a little bit like those ABGs that I mentioned, those bone groups. We have groups of artifacts. What we've called bundling here is a good anthropological term here for bundles are often referred to in ethnography in terms of curating groups of materials and doing something a bit interesting and special with them. And the materials themselves in some ways couldn't be more mundane and ordinary. So here you've got a range of stone tools and some fragments of animal bone, but they seem to have been brought together and deposited together as little groupings. And as I say, you would lift up the floor slabs and here would be a little grouping of these materials. So they're marking the end of one stage and the beginning of another. So we can see them reflecting on the changes that they're making. There's no practical reason, in inverted commas, why they should do this. They're not leveling up the floors. In fact, some of these objects are a bit up and down in terms of the three-dimensional impact they have on the floor. If anything, they make the floor less even rather than more even. So it's not that they're doing, it's something else. And that also includes things like large sherds of pottery thrust on edge into these occupation deposits as well before they cover them up with the new floor. So again, I would very much argue we're looking at very intentional depositional practices here. Okay, so let's think about the way this broch was divided. I've called that house divided. So the truth of the matter is as complex as that arrangement, and unusual as that arrangement, that multiply subdivided arrangement the broch is, what it actually boils down to is two major suites of rooms. Each suite of room with mutual access from the suite, from one room to the next. So on the northern side of the interior, illustrated by the kind of purpley arrows there, you've got the west room, the north room, and the northeast room, and intramural chambers on the wall open off of that. And then on the southern hemisphere of the interior, a south room and a southeast room. Each of those suites was mutually accessible, but they were separated out from each other. So what we're really looking at is bipartite division inside the broch. Now this is really unusual for classic Orkney brochs with a single central hearth, a large surrounding open area, and then perhaps radial partitions and bays on the periphery of that large circular space. So there's something really quite different going on here, and we can see that in that little schematic. So there's your classic Orkney Iron Age roundhouse and broch layout, a big central hearth at the heart of the building, then large open areas and radial partitions. And if I was a betting man, what I would say this architecture represents in social terms, in terms of the household, the domestic relations, is there's at least an idealised suggestion through this architecture that the household have solidarity, that they're in it together, that they all access from different directions and components and zones of the interior, they all access that central hearth, and they eat communally, and they consume and process and prepare food communally at the heart of the interior of these structures. So that's what your classic Iron Age roundhouse and broch looks like, and similarly here at Howe also. So something very different going on at the Cairns. Now, again, and I'm mentioning him about 3 or 4 times here, but he's a very influential figure. But Neil Sharples has turned to this figure in the back catalogue of classic anthropology to talk about Iron Age society in Britain, but in Atlantic Scotland in particular. This is Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French anthropologist, very, very famous French anthropologist, incredibly active in the 1950s and especially in the 1960s. And he came up with this idea of house societies to explain a problem he encountered. And the problem that he encountered was that some of the societies he was looking at ethnographically, so non-Western societies in the modern era, didn't seem to have a very marked kinship structure, or rather, that kinship didn't seem to be defined and articulated through blood relatedness. It didn't seem to be based on families. And for decades now, anthropologists and archaeologists have paid their dues to the anthropological work of Lévi-Strauss. Anytime they want to suggest, well, actually, the Western notion of how a household is put together, how it's composed, that mum and dad and 2.4 kids, and if you fancy it, the extended family of granny and granddad, etc. That's a very classic Western mode of household occupancy, but loads of societies around the world don't look like that at all. And Lévi-Strauss, when he was trying to figure out what was going on in these Polynesian societies who didn't seem to live in a family-based way, finally cracked the code, as far as he was concerned, was that the house itself was the mechanism by which ancestry and inheritance and lineage was conveyed, almost like medieval houses, in that sense of the word. House Targaryen, if you want to popularise it in terms of Game of Thrones. The idea of house being lineage and symbolic of your history and your ancestry, as much as it is the physical trappings and surroundings of your family structure. And so people come together and mark their lineage and their belongingness vis-a-vis the household. And so a number of archaeologists, name-checked here, have suggested that this is a way of looking at Iron Age society with its huge emphasis on houses. But I would add a little flavour to this, and hopefully you'll see why. Maybe you'll get a clue as to why in a minute, but also maybe you'll be seeing where I've come from in what I've been saying already about the way that the household in the Cairns is structured. So the two major divisions that the anthropologists have traditionally defined post-marital residency in households is either through matrilocalism or patriarchalism. By far and away, the vast majority of societies around the world that we know of have lived in a way that's similar to ours in the sense that at marriage, women marry into the household of their husband. But there are a number of societies where that's reversed and where men marry into and physically move into the household of women. And in those societies, there's a number of things that anthropologists have noted that are common to either patrilocal or matrilocal conditions. So in matrilocal ones, it's really big house interiors because you have large groups of kin sharing household space and generations of females in matrilocal terms, their daughters, granddaughters, nieces, etc., and a small number of male relatives. And they've even managed to put a figure on that. 95 metres squared and above in the ethnographic record seems to be the golden ratio. Beyond that, you seem to have more tendency towards a society being matrilocal. Weirdly enough, even things as precise as this, simple material culture based on tools, based on workaday objects, and simple but very intense arable farming. So almost like gardening, almost horticulture, really incessant weeding and that kind of thing going on. Curation of soils, enhancement of soils, manuring the soils, tight plots of small garden-like plots of field systems, but where the crop is super abundant and really healthy because so much input and effort is put into the making of it. And then in patrilocal type societies, what we find is something rather different. So much smaller house size, but often lots and lots of different chambers and rooms within those house interiors. Quite elaborate material culture, including sumptuary objects, so prestige objects as defined by that society. And very intensive but extensified arable farming, so wider out. And one of the things that economic anthropologists talk about again and again and again, almost like a bit of a cliche, but quite a funny phrase, is that patrilocal arrangements are often typified by cows and ploughs. That's how they talk about them. And here's a range of anthropologists that have drawn together these caricatures of society. So what do we find missing in the Iron Age in terms of their farming systems here in Atlantic Scotland? Well, these are the things that are missing. These are the things that have typified tillage and farming in Orkney through much of the Neolithic and all of the Bronze Age. So these big flakestone bars on the left here, these are essentially mattock blades that would have been hafted in wooden handles. On some sites, hundreds of them are found. And these are for hand tilling and breaking up the sod. And then on the right-hand side there, stone ploughshares that are used to plough up reasonably extensive stretches of farmland. And in the Iron Age, beginning of the Iron Age, they disappear. Puff of smoke. In terms of archaeology, it's as if it's in the wink of an eye. Now, some people have suggested that in the Iron Age they're using iron ones, and because iron doesn't preserve very well in the ground and because it's eminently recyclable, the iron ploughs don't get recovered in the archaeological record. However, I don't actually think there was that much iron around to replace the volume of hard points that we see in earlier prehistory. And what Anne Clark, the stone tool specialist, has suggested and noted is that as those objects die out, what we have is a rise in cattle scapulae, much lighter objects, often with wear on the edge of the blade. And what I would like to suggest is these are the objects that are used in much closer hand tillage, the kind of thing you get in garden plots and smaller, very enhanced field systems of the type that we find very tightly around Middle Iron Age settlements of the Atlantic Scottish Iron Age. Now, if you want a wee bit of empirical evidence straight from the Cairns as to what's going on with the actual crop that these people are growing, here you go. So during the period of the Broch, we see an increase in both the length and the width of the barley grains that people are growing at the site of the Cairns. So the barley grains are getting thicker and fatter. And meanwhile, the weeds of cultivation that we recover incidentally with the charred cereal grain also shows the chickweed and really healthy weeds that are growing with really healthy crops. So the barley is getting larger and larger, thicker and fatter, more and more nutritious, more and more calorific, until we hit the final stage of the Broch, and then bang, it disappears, drops off, and suddenly the barley's getting thinner. And this is right at the time when the broch ends at the Cairns. And what we see instead of those weeds of cultivation, what we find is loads and loads of weeds that would have grown in grassland and pasture formerly. And what it looks like they're doing is they're suddenly expanding out, they're extensifying into the wider landscape, and they're taking more of the land that was formerly pasture and grassland in under the plough. So they're seeking to extend their farming reach, but it's into ground that hasn't been as the previous previous arable land fields have. It's land that wasn't that well cultivated previously, so the barley is a little bit withery for it. Now, they may be more than making up the quality with the quantity, but the point is, it's a very different approach to the landscape. They're taking far more of it in, and they're tending each patch far less intensively. So, does this align with any of the things that I've been saying about matrilocalism and patrilocalism? And indeed, another dimension of matrilocal societies being matrilineal descent, marking inheritance and descent through the female line. And then, hot off the press this year, this study undertaken on the genetics of Iron Age cemetery populations, principally in the Dorset area, but also including Iron Age populations across Britain, including data from Orkney, which does indeed suggest, as its title suggests, pervasive matrilocality in Iron Age Britain. So the genetic evidence is now building up, including data from the Cairns excavations from our small number of human remains that we have. Now, let me be plain, what I'm not suggesting here is anything like the long and tortuous discussions that have been had in early medieval and Pictish studies about claims that Pictish society was matrilocal. So ever since the 19th century, and the recognition of some of the comments of the likes of Bede, that Pictish ancestry operated through the female line, at least conditionally, when there was no clear male successor to a line, and this is seen in the Pictish king lists as given to us through Irish annals. That has been roundly declaimed and critiqued, and I feel rightly so, and even recently, genetically, that's been poo-pooed as well, and I would go along with that. So what I am saying is that I strongly suspect that early and middle Iron Age society, with its huge houses, its intensive arable infield agriculture, its emphasis on fairly simplistic material culture, tool-based tool kits, and large floor spaces of buildings, could well have been matrilocal and matrilineal in its construction. But it's a bit of a blip between the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the later Iron Age. And it only lasts for that time period. And I'd like to explain maybe my rationale for that in just a moment. So here's our twin subdivisions of our broch building, the two hemispheres with the two principal hearth complexes. And my wife, when looking at this the other day, remarked that there was a certain well-known animated character that she immediately thought of when she saw this. And even had the audacity to point out some physical similarities between the originator of that graphic and the graphic, but we'll leave that to one side for now, shall we? Thank you, Amanda. So these two hearth groups of activity arranged around them, really quite marked in terms of the materials that have been processed on them. So in the west room in particular, huge amounts of red deer, more than 50% of the animal bone in that western room, and in that suite in the north side of the broch, red deer, huge amounts of red deer material. And inside the broch in general, just under, a little bit under 50% in terms of deer, cattle, sheep, goat, seal, pig, fish, and whale in descending order. Whereas outside the broch, the column on the right-hand side there, the classic Iron Age triptych of animal species are represented in the village buildings. Sheep, goat, cattle, sharing a third each of the total and then pig 14%, and then the descending order bird, horse, fish, deer, etc. So you can see very different animal remains represented between the broch and the village buildings outside, which is something we'll really look forward to getting more detail on from the post-ex work that we're doing this year. And this is going to be hopefully some real insight into the differences and distinctions between the broch household over hundreds of years and the village inhabitants. But what's more, even more interestingly, is that our two suites, and principally our two main rooms, our west room and our southeast room, also have really sharp distinctions between them. So I've coined it a broch bestiary, and in real terms what it means is the west room is chock-a-block with red deer, cattle, lots of charred barley, some shellfish. And in the south and southeast rooms, it's marine protein, it's whalebone, it's fish, it's shellfish, it's seal, it's some pigs, it's some sheep, but in small numbers, and huge quantities of barley. So very different, and that's repeated throughout those floor sequences that I went through, generation after generation for 200 years plus. So there's these very strong differences between the one suite and the other suite, maintained around separate hearths over the generations. And I'm really just at risk of repeating myself by reading any of that out, and similarly this. Now we're very, very fortunate, very lucky to have tiny fragments of human bone associated with the site, and not large quantities of them, and that's where, to some extent, this becomes more tenuous, and we need to do more work, and we hope to find more human remains with which to do this work. But in tandem with the good fortune of recovering these tiny human remains, fragments of remains, from the broch and from outside of it, we've also been very fortunate to hook up with an amazing research project called COMIOS, based out of University of York, and Professor Ian Armit and Dr. Maddie Bleasdale and a host of others there, and working in collaboration with the Harvard's Genetic Institute as well. And through that work, we've been able to do they've been able to do amazing genetic work. And this is really exciting stuff because it's showing long distance, quite reasonably close family connections between the people at the Cairns and other Iron Age communities and populations across the north of Scotland. So in this case, illustrating here, relationships between the Cairns and individuals at amazing sites like High Pasture Cave on Skye or North Berwick Hill Fort down in East Lothian. Relatively close family connections. But almost as important, almost as exciting, almost as dramatic as these is the isotope analysis, and particularly really detailed compound specific isotope analysis. That's where they look at a whole array of different isotopes and combine and statistically model and Bayesian model the results. And what that's showing us is marine protein and animals and foodstuffs from the Cairns with the isotopic values from the protein of meals consumed by individuals at the Cairns. And through the genetics, we know the biological sex of these individuals as well. And what it's shown us is that females group with huge amounts of marine protein, and males are grouping with terrestrial protein, lots and lots of red meat. Does that echo the internal arrangements of the broch occupation deposits and what we saw in terms of those relative species present? So are we looking at gender division within the heart of the household? I think it might be one of the identifiers within that broch structure. Okay, so I'll finish off shortly, don't worry folks, but as I do that, in conclusion, I just want to consider what happens after the broch at the site, at the Cairns and beyond. And what we're looking at, and I've added in an earlier Iron Age house, is this sequence effectively in essence. So early and middle Iron Age roundhouses, the open interior, the central hearth that we see from the earlier part of the first millennium BC on the far left. In the centre, the new arrangements of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD in the heart of the house at the Cairns with its more complex internal subdivision. and its bipartite layout. And then the first transformation, the newest style of architecture after the Broch period, these sub-rectangular buildings that we call WAGs on the right-hand side here. This is the Cairns structure B1 and B2. And we've radiocarbon dated this building, and WAGs are not well understood and very poorly radiocarbon dated. Traditionally, there's far more of them found in Caithness, but there are signs of them in Orkney as well, such as at Howe, the stalled building at Howe, so-called. And here at the Cairns, we've been lucky, we've been able to radiocarbon date this building, and instead of it being 6th and 7th century AD, as usually expected, we find the radiocarbon dates for our WAGs are somewhat earlier. And importantly, they are in the 5th and 4th centuries AD, and that makes them, rather than the equivalent of post-Roman in date, it makes them equivalent to late Roman in date. So the Romans are still in Britain at the time where these buildings are starting to be constructed. What is a WAG? Well, it's not those things on the left-hand side. It's not the wives and girlfriends. It's these sub-rectangular buildings of the type found in the type site WAG of Forres. They are semi-set down, they're sub-rectangular, they're internally quite complex, divided, multiple rooms and chambers, different sorts of floor coverings, etc. on them. And at our site, importantly, because of the radiocarbon dates, we know what else is going on in the site at the time where these WAGs are getting established at the site. And that includes these wonderful pieces of personal adornment, a reconstruction pin to go with the mould matrix that we're recovering from site. So these objects are being produced in large numbers, over 60 of these fired clay moulds from phase 5 of the site, the equivalent of the WAG period. Metalworking materials, this one just from 2025 this year, one lovely whetstone. New types of material culture, large numbers of rotiquerns for the first time at the Cairns, as with some other sites like Old Scatness, in the post-Broch period, not in the peri-Broch period. New styles of pottery, including this, lots and lots of this redware, this fine pinkish reddish orange, nicely burnished ceramic that we encounter at this time. And then exotic querns like this so-called Type 1C. It's difficult to see it or make it out because it's a fragment, but it has a decorated central hopper and handle hole of a diagnostic type, most of which are found in the northeast mainland of Scotland in the Pictish area. So there's one of our structure B areas under excavation this year. It's at this time that we have the first gaming equipment present on site, draft light counters and conical gaming pieces. And then last year in the excavations, also Roman vessel glass entering into these communities at this time as this kind of drinking cup, decorated or engraved drinking cup from the Cairns. Wrote about this in the latest edition of the Orkney Archaeology Review if you want to take a look at it. And it's at this time that we also have this extensification of the arable. So it's a time of change in ways, arguably shifts in power, centralisation of power, more elaborate material culture, a resumption of single inhumation burials. This is a real society in transformation. And I would take the view that Richard Tingley and others have, and here's some of their outputs, that the reach of the empire could be seen in modern terms as equivalent to what we call globalization these days, that you don't have to actually be within the physical bounds of the empire to be really quite substantially affected by its nearby proximity. So, you might guess why I'm suggesting that matrilocal traditional society of early and middle Iron Age comes to an end at this very moment in time, along with all these other changes that are occurring. And looking back actually into the back catalogue of archaeological material, we can actually see there are far more of these bipartite divisions present in other Broch sites that have been not so much written about or talked about too much, but actually includes very well-known sites like Midhow and sites like the recently or relatively recently excavated Old Scatness and Jarlshof, where we have medial walls and internal partitions that subdivide the buildings. And in some cases, as in Old Scatness at the lower right there, we even see the hints of differential material culture, distinctions that are relatively similar to the the disparities in the inventories of objects and materials that we see at the Cairns. So this is part of a wider societal process. The old ways of the traditional roundhouses are being broken up and transformed, and these areas have been subdivided. It used to be thought commonly that this is merely a response to inheritance claims changing over time. You know, it's almost like that episode of Steptoe and Son from the late 60s where they fall out with each other and they put a curtain across and then have to, you know, the ridiculous impracticality of operating in a building with this flimsy central division. You know, that to me, that interpretation of as the household grows, they have to subdivide incessantly smacks of a sort of quite an artificial situation. And at the Cairns, what we've seen, because our broch was built from the outset in that bi-modular, bipartite way, it's baked into the architecture. It's what they intended. It's not an ad hoc or post hoc response to something that's changing. It's the way they wanted that broch to be laid out from the outset. So it's a much more profound change. And I think it allows us to peer into the dynamics of a society very much transforming itself. And we're very lucky at the Cairns where our particular broch just happens to be poised on that major, major transformation. And it allows us to have insights and produce case studies on what happens when different worlds clash and collide, arguably, and what transformations occur from that. So I'll shut up there for now. Just thank all those funding bodies and contributors and say thanks very much to you, to the team, and that's me. You'll be glad to hear it.
Thanks, Martin. That was really interesting, and we're happy to open the floor for questions. If anyone's got any questions or comments for Martin, if you put your hand up. Oh, sorry.
Martin, do you think that of all the finds and understanding that's come out of the Cairns, has that fitted comfortably within the overall body of knowledge about the Iron Age and structures and its peoples, or is there anything at the Cairns that sits sort of rather uncomfortably in that sort of
do you mean, does it discomfort the establishment, or do you mean, does it discomfort me? Is it maybe a bit of both in some ways? Well, as we've excavated this site, and hopefully I'm getting somewhere close to the intention of your question. As we've excavated the site, I have personally found lots of it strange and weird and unusual and not as expected. And one of the major ones that I've talked about this afternoon is just that the way in which that broch is internally laid out. And each and every time I encounter that, I have a brief moment, and by brief moment I mean probably a few weeks, where I go, what? Why is it doing this? Why isn't it doing what I kind of expect it to do? But I find that quite refreshing and reassuring that I'm able to, after a while, overcome that feeling of slight disappointment, slight surprise, slight discomfort, and then just start thinking about what could that mean then. And also, hopefully, what it means, without stroking my own ego, what it hopefully means is that I'm capable of remaining open-minded and then responding to what we encounter. And to some extent, you know, excavators always excavate with a kind of mental template in mind of what something should look like, because we always emphasize parallels and analogies and similarities, and it's a type 1C, it's a, you know, it's that type of a roundhouse, or it's that type of feature or whatever. And we all of us in archaeology have that mental back catalogue in mind, in the mental filing cabinet. And so when we're out in the field, we hope and expect to see things we recognise, because then we can start thinking we can maybe understand them. And what we need to remain open to is the little differences that we encounter, which could make such a big difference in terms of understanding. And if we want to think about change in these past societies, that change is hardly ever going to reside at the very centre of society. Change is often happening at the margins of society, and it might be quite modest, and it might be quite modest things, humble things that are going on that look a bit strange, but they might be the seeds of change that mushroom and over the generations become a major transformation of that society. So to that extent, I hope to remain open-minded to the little things that are different, because in those, assuredly, is the real difference that, that we're trying to get at as archaeologists, I hope. But then if you also meant, do I get any kickback from colleagues? I presented something a wee bit similar to this, but shorter, at a big Iron Age conference in Cardiff in May, and loads of them came up to me after and said, "Oh, that's great. It's good that we're thinking along these lines." So I hope we're along the right lines, but we'll see.
If I could take you back to the dietary evidence and the construction of the broch, which seems very interesting indeed. Have you any thoughts about, with the West Room being dominated by the deer and the cattle, especially in barley, and then the south and the southeast being completely varied, is that leading you to conclude anything like the boys are in the west eating the good food and the girls are in the other part eating a varied diet, or the social strata is different in the west to the east? Are these kind of thoughts in your head?
Yeah, absolutely, and it could be both of those things simultaneously. And to some extent, when I'm talking about society as a matrilocal society, one of the things that I didn't mention so much, but which characterises matrilocal and matrilineal conditions in non-Western societies, is that women have, in general terms, on average, a greater say in the affairs of communities than they do in patrilocal societies. There's also a whole series of subsidiary aspects to that, including there's far less domestic violence in matrilocal societies than there is in patrilocal, because essentially, because men marry into a group of females, the woman, the wife in that situation, is with her family. She's not dislocated from her birth family, her natal family. So there's greater social equity for women, generally speaking, in matrilocal and matrilineal conditions. So if we've got this gender division at heart within the heart of the broch at the Cairns, it's under some transformation and it's under pressure, I think. And that's what this breaking down of the internal arrangements is all about. But for hundreds of years, whoever it is in those two spheres of that broch are conducting really quite separate lives, where never the twain shall meet in terms of sharing food, processing food, concepts of purity and hygiene and things not transgressing and moving across those boundaries, arguably. And they're very neat, they're very assiduous and diligent about it. And in anthropological terms, I don't think that's taskscapes or zonations of different tasks and activities. I think it's definitely got to be culture and society and domestic relations that lie behind that. And based on the isotopic evidence from the humans so far and the faunal evidence from the floors, it does look like gender's a serious component of that distinction that's underway there. And what I would suggest is that the Cairns is an example of the midway point, the transformation from matrilocal to patrilocal. And that even in that broch in the 1st and 2nd century AD, it's already under pressure, and that forces in that society are already trying to revoke the Iron Age tradition of matrilocality, and that indeed that it's groups of men that are in that west room, and that it's groups of women in that south and southeast room. The women aren't sequestered there in a sort of classical Greece style household. I don't believe that for a minute. For one thing, their apartment is the only apartment on the ground floor of the broch that accesses the upper reaches of the broch. So if we believe this narrative that I'm thinking of, then, and that the south and southeast room is the female zone, they've also got access to the full run of the upper reaches of the broch. So even more floor space available to them, which is very much in line with what anthropologists think about the floor space that women have in matrilocal, matrilineal societies. But it is changing, it is under pressure. And I think already in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, young men are both being attracted to the Roman Empire and repulsed by it to the extent where they're raiding on it. And they're experiencing it, they're encountering it, they're acquiring Roman objects, they're seeing a different worldview, they're seeing the Roman world that's very paternalistic, they're seeing how you can live a different way, and I think that's got to sow the seeds of corroding that traditional Iron Age society. So what I was kind of more implicitly suggesting was contact with Rome erodes the traditions of traditional Iron Age society. And it's a little bit like Vietnam in the late 60s and 70s, or Korea, or the British Empire, or any number of colonial intercultural encounters in that regard. And at the heart of it, the heart of the change in any society is, first of all, domestic relations and conditions get undermined. And as soon as you undermine the family household, as it were, the rest of society follows suit, arguably. So it's a kind of salutary tale in a way, if we're in any way accurate about it or correct. But we've got to bear in mind, though, that it's not changeless and timeless, because I'm arguing it only comes about at the end of the Bronze Age, this matrilineal thing. And what's that all about? Well, it's the trauma of the Bronze Age, the collapse of the Bronze Age, as it were, and what that does to society and how that closes down international networks and connections that then creates the conditions for this different sort of set of communities during the early and middle Iron Age.
Thank you. Martin, how did they put the roof on?
With huge amounts of difficulty and danger, I suspect. It's always troubled archaeologists and interpreters of brochs. We have no problem whatsoever imagining substantial roundhouses, particularly timber roundhouses, especially those found down south in the south of England and the Wessex core area of the Iron Age down there. We tend to have no problem envisaging these massive conical timber roofs with their 45-degree angle pitched thatch on top of them, because the walls of those houses are relatively low on the ground, we think, and therefore that seems a bit more manageable and possible and tenable. And as soon as you put the eaves of that building up 13 metres above the ground floor, suddenly it becomes a much more thoughtful prospect. So I agree, it's difficult to imagine, but these people have got no problem with difficulty. If there's one thing we know about prehistoric communities in general, and certainly for the Iron Age, there's no lack of industry. There's also arguably an extreme lack of health and safety legislation as well. So I don't think they think anything of shinning up these buildings. And of course, episodically, those organic roofs would need to be repaired, they need to be maintained, they need to be fixed. Instead of seeing that as a negative thing, of course, though, prehistorians have got used to the idea of these are opportunities to reaffirm what that thing meant and what its importance was in the first place. So by routinely maintaining roofs and other elements of these buildings and structures, you are repeating and reiterating the circumstances that led to them being constructed in the first place. The social, political and cultural conditions, if you will, that gave rise to those buildings in the first place. And then if every 2 or 3 generations you've got to repair that roof, then that's a big deal. That's a big project the community has to get on with, and maybe even involves other communities to come in and help. So you're not just building and maintaining a building, you're building and maintaining Iron Age society. So, but yes, technically difficult, absolutely.
Yeah, would there have been enough trees in those days?
No.
No.
Well, not in Orkney, almost certainly.
I'm going to ask another question. May I ask another question?
Yep, by all means.
You know the souterrain?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, in the Isle of Skye, just down from the Isle of Skye Museum, there's a long souterrain, which I went into. And they stored cheese, I think it was cheese, in bog butter. Am I right there?
We've never found any evidence of bog butter actually in souterrains, but we've found plenty of evidence of bog butter in peat bogs, indeed, yeah.
Did they store food over winter in the souterrain at the Cairns? Or, if not, butter or cheese?
$64,000 question. What is a souterrain for? We literally don't know 100% the answer to that question. And at the risk of getting drawn into a long excursus on the history of souterrain research, There are three principal ways in which they've been interpreted: refuge, which is nonsense; storage, which is tenable; and ritual, which is also tenable. But that idea of having to pick between these different options interpretively is itself it's overly functionalist, and it forgets that people don't necessarily just have one purpose to put a building or a setting to. So you could perfectly easily have storage and ritual encompassed in one building. In fact, for Iron Age communities, as for any farming community, the overwintering of produce, or indeed the storage of the seed corn to restart the harvest the following year, is so important that it's bound to be hedged around with religious and other special connotations. And what we find in southern England during the Iron Age, in a similar period of time as the Cairns, is that the big underground grain storage pits and silos are assuredly used to store grain and other produce, but when they have to clean them out episodically, burn them out and clean them out because bacteria grows and they go mouldy and go off, they'll often find special groups of deposits placed inside of them. Magics, it could be argued, and other special items and groups of animal bones, and sometimes even human remains, and sometimes quite terrifyingly dealt with human remains, with decapitated adults and children and the like, that sort of groupings of materials. Well, I have to say the souterrains in Atlantic Scotland, and especially in Orkney, show the same sorts of depositional treatment, including human remains, involved in way more than 60% of souterrains excavated in Orkney, for example, have some kind of association with human remains, as well as a range of other items and materials. So whatever they are, whatever those souterrains are for, and we really hope that our project is going to go some way, probably in the post-ex stages, to clarifying this, but whatever they are for and however they're used, they're both kind of architecturally and in terms of the deposits found inside of them, they're clearly very, very important structures. And if I'm a better man, I'd say they're both storage and highly ritualized buildings at the same time. And trying to pick apart whether they start off as storage and then become ritualized, or they start off as ritual and become storage, I think is futile, and we'll never get to the bottom of that conundrum, that chicken and egg. You're welcome. I could and have given whole presentations on souterrains because it's one of my favourite things of all.
Hi Martin, I've got the mic now. Picking up on the answer you were giving on roofing, it's one of the things which has really been perplexing me. So, one of the things that really been perplexing me as a brockaholic of many years. And whatever roofing model you follow in terms of low roof or high roof, the volume of timber and the volume of timber of certain length and certain calibre required to roof a broch is immense. Yeah. And Orkney, Caithness, Shetland doesn't have that timber. No. So there must be an economic network which enables them to obtain timber of such quality, in such volume, and whenever they needed it. Yep. Which implies that Orkney, Shetland, Caithness, we're producing something that folk down south wanted.
If it's bilateral trade, if trade is the thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But I just wonder what these northern brochs were producing in such quantity that was so desirable that they could sell it down south. And given that you've got a very rich material culture at the Cairns, is there any clue as to what the Cairns might have been producing for export in volume?
I think if you look at modern Orkney, there's some clues, because when you look at Orkney, I think when visitors from abroad come to Orkney, they expect Orkney to look like the Western Isles, rugged and rough terrain and patches of farmland. And it's not really like that, is it? It's beautiful, rolling, pastoral, bucolic countryside, albeit not many trees. Huge potential for growing crops. And we've got massive amounts of cereal grain, carbonised cereal grain being stored almost certainly in these brochs, and certainly being uncovered by us during the excavations. So if it's that kind of dyadic relationship where you give us this and we give you that, then the quid pro quo, in my view, would be agricultural produce, animals and cereals. But the evidence for it, scant though it may be, those genetic relationships that indicated far-flung, long-distance, close family connections. And I've got another one for you after the video goes off to tell you about as well. But I can only tell you about it after the video. But you know, I think that mobility, that literal mobility of people around the north of Scotland and maybe beyond, is indicative of people getting about, and those networks existed and how they would be fleshed out literally through interaction of people. And as much as anything, give us your timber and we'll give you our agreement on all sorts of issues. We are friends, we're colleagues, we are forging alliances, we have marriage partners that are going your direction and coming our direction. The famous amphory from Gurness that you know about, that Andrew Fitzpatrick wrote about in 1989 as a manifestation of a very specific type of high status Roman material culture, only ever found in one tiny corner of the southeast of England around Colchester, Camulodunum. And he evokes the idea that actually this shows connections amongst the Iron Age groups of Orkney and the far southeast of England. Yeah, I don't think that's too far-fetched at all for these Iron Age communities. I think they're very well aware of each other and kind of interconnected. We're used to thinking of the Iron Age as a sort of fragmentary mosaic of isolated societies. After the glories of the Bronze Age and the international metals network, etc., that we can verify through the material culture, the Iron Age is thought to be this sort of inward-looking, very fragmented mosaic of societies that are quite isolated. But clearly people are moving over long distance, and we don't recover the boats, the craft that are doing that very often, if at all, for the Iron Age, but they must have existed. So, yeah.
Thanks, Martin. Is there any more questions before we end the session? Oh, one there. I'll take this. This will be the last one, and then we can move on to Martin's teaser.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. I'm intrigued by your multiple references to drains.
All down the drain.
Obviously, water is not something we think of as structural, but when you look at water systems, they are. I'm thinking of slightly more modern systems in Bali or Yunnan, where they tell you a lot about property systems, about social organization, about hierarchy, as well as about hygiene, in the sense of it's perfectly possible to have separate treatment of animals and waste and washing your veg and to be safe and healthy in ways that many of us have only just learned much more recently. So I'm just wondering if you can connect what you now know about drains at the Cairns to any of the cultural topics you've been talking about.
Yeah, well, I hope we will be able to. I'm not sure we could do a very good or effective or cohesive job of that yet, but what I hope in post-ex is that we will see the sorts of things in excavation results or outcomes, or post-excavation outcomes, that, for example, in a very different chronological and cultural setting, was encountered at Neolithic Barnhouse by Colin Richards and Andy Jones in the 1980s, where they identified two networks of drains within the heart of that settlement that didn't cross over, didn't overlap, and very distinctive recipes of ceramics that had found their way into those drains incidentally through wastage, but which, when petrologically analysed, were discovered to be composed of clays and temper ingredients that were from very divergent corners of the landscape. And then similarly, the residues, the lipid residues from those ceramics indicated different meals consumed. And their conclusion that they drew on that was they were looking at two very different types of people in that village, an inner hub and an outer ring. Never the twain shall meet. A tiny little bit like what we found, but within one building at the Cairns, within our Broch building. Social distinction, cultural distinction, maybe family groups that varied was the argument for Barnhouse, for sure. Now, I don't know, I don't want to leap to any conclusions, but I wouldn't be surprised if the very same sorts of things are going on articulated through the subsurface features of the drains in the Iron Age communities as well. It may have different meanings, it may have different social significance within the Iron Age society, but I would be very surprised if the mechanism that controls your world in terms of your kind of what they used to call ontological security, the idea that you've got confidence in the world around you and you're happy and confident, and psychologically there's well-being because that's over there and that's over there, and there's a place for everything and everything in its place, and that represents the social order and the natural order of things that you're told should be the case. I'd be very surprised if that doesn't also pertain to the drainage system in the Iron Age at the Cairns. But complicating that is the fact that we've got these subterranean structures, these so-called wells and souterrains as well, which are clearly not drains, but they do delve into the subsurface of the world. They make intrusions into it, they transgress the laminar surfaces of the social order, the natural order of the world in really interesting ways. So hopefully by the end of the post-ex process, we'll be able to answer your question much more effectively.
Thanks, Martin. So that just leaves me to thank everybody for coming along this afternoon, and to thank Martin for giving such an interesting talk on a really interesting topic. Particularly, I'm interested in the matriarchal society aspect of things. I find that fascinating, not just through the evidence, but actually what that would mean for the people that were living in that time, and how different that was for how we're living right now.
Yeah, I can feel some really experimental archaeology coming on in that regard.
I like that idea.
Let's give it a go, see if it works for us.
We can't be doing any worse than we are just now. So if everybody'd just like to thank Martin, put their hands together.